we tried to take the main major questions that came up. There were a few small minor ones that we're not going to touch on, but all the main big ones. And what I'm gonna do is kick it off with Clark starting off on answering some questions. And one of the questions we got, which was, kind of what are the changes that we're seeing here with their being recommended within our code, and then how are they being used elsewhere, and how are they working? So I'm turning it over to Clark now to kind of give an answer to some of that, and he has the next few slides, and then I'll jump back in later.
Great, thanks, Derek. So when Derek was asking about this question and we were following up, I thought I have there are a lot of, to begin with, there are a lot of different places that are making these changes. I think as Janine said very well, people are recognizing that the market is changing and we need to be more responsive to different needs and different desires. And so that's a big part of it, and the market is responding. And belatedly, local governments are making tweaks to their code. So you guys aren't alone in this. One place that we've seen some progress is actually where I live. This is in Glenwood Springs, and this is a project that my wife and I actually did. This is a classic missing middle project. In this case, it was really a rehab, but everything we wanted to do really required a certain set of policy to be in place. And so I just thought I'd walk through this one as a starting point, and then we have a couple other examples. But so this used to be a very large kind of, actually originally it was the mortuary in Glenwood Springs, and then had been turned into and globbed onto over the years. It was a very large single family home with this garage space that you can see that looked completely different from this here. And we were interested, because I spend time in my organizational life encouraging communities and helping communities through this work of expanding missing middle housing. When we saw this opportunity in our own neighborhood to help expand housing choices there, we sort of jumped on it, and we thought it'd be nice to dip our toe in the waters of trying the development stuff. And so the big idea was to bring affordable but high quality units to Glenwood Springs, to take this really large single family home and break it up into smaller units that would meet some of the needs that we were hearing about in downtown Glenwood Springs. And we needed to do that within something that was going to be financially feasible, and therefore it would also need to fit within the code framework and the policy framework that we had in Glenwood Springs. You can go, and just to provide a little bit more about the project, so this is 9 units, and it sits on top of a co-working space, which is that garage space you see there. Go ahead, Derek. So, thinking about what made this possible so that you guys can know sort of what needs to happen, and I think these are the types of things that every community should do in terms of sort of that enabling good projects to happen, that first piece of the policy spectrum. The comprehensive plan was very clear in saying we want to see housing choices in the downtown. So that alone was really helpful. The code followed that. And I'll dig a little bit more into the specifics of what made that possible. But the other thing that had happened is in our downtown, and this is in other neighborhoods within our community happening as well, but in our downtown, there had been some capital investments that had made in terms of parking and really amenitizing and making walkable streets and things like that, that really set the stage for us to think this was a good place to do this type of investment. From a zoning perspective, the changes had been made to make it possible to actually do what the comp plan called for, which was to bring more diverse housing choices into the downtown. And so some specific things that made this possible were setbacks and making it so that those were not as large as they had been before and brought more to a downtown context, and dimensional standards that gave us the sort of room within the building envelope to work with, because if we had gone in and done this type of project without those, even though it was a rehab, it would have triggered us to actually, we wouldn't have been able to do the units that we wanted to do. We would have only been able to bring 4 units to this instead of 9. So that ability to work within those standards was really significant in terms of us being able to do something like this. And then parking was a big deal too. And in downtown Glenwood Springs, up to a certain threshold, you can meet your parking requirements through on-street parking, because we have a gridded street network that provides a lot of parking options. And so that's what we took advantage of as well. We ultimately also, sort of stepping over to that other part of this policy spectrum, the city was offering a partial fee waiver if you maintained rents at an affordable level. And we did that for a couple units, not all of them, just to sort of experiment and see how it went, and we tried it out. So that was really helpful. The bad side of it was the process was still really ambiguous, and we lost a lot of time to that. And that process ambiguity, and I won't go into the whole story because it's actually a wild one, opened the door up for pretty significant NIMBYism. Fortunately, the project and the plan and everything was clear enough in terms of where the city actually had said, you know, this is stuff that's good and what we want, that we were able to get it approved. But it didn't mean that there weren't a few people that came out of the woodwork and didn't want to see something like this. And since then, it's funny, we've had great compliments, and neighbors are now very happy about the project because it looks a lot better than it did. But not surprisingly, people were frightened about change. Go ahead, Derek. So similarly, this is actually, we moved my mom to Glenwood recently, and the city, we've been talking to the city about some specific changes they needed to do to make it possible to build accessory dwelling units. And then also working with my mom to try to figure out how do we get you closer to us. In a real estate market like this was hard. And one way we knew we could do it is if we could find a house where we could put an accessory dwelling unit in back, so that then we and her could afford that home that she would live in. And that's what you see here. This would not have been possible to build without some changes that the city of Glenwood Springs made specific to setbacks. And I'm talking about, you know, a few feet made the difference to be able to fit something like this into a space like that. And it made all the difference. And you can see from scale, you can see we really benchmarked off of the image on the left in terms of height. We benchmarked off of that. So the structure we built, even though it looks tall from where you're sort of looking down, you know, up to it, it's actually shorter than the next structure over. And so it really fits from a context perspective. And that's the thing about both of these two things. You know, if you're cruising through a single family neighborhood, both of these projects fit perfectly in a single family neighborhood. It's a very comfortable level of density, and they were, you know, very strategic and practical code changes, the very types of things that Derek and his team and the rest of the city are working on with you guys that made this possible. Just today, and so it fits and it works in neighborhoods, and it creates healthy neighborhoods. Just today, I actually got a call from the city of Gunnison saying that some code changes that they had worked on coming out of a project like what you guys did with us and the Thrive Initiative had also been successful. And they were starting to see the private sector respond, and they actually sent me some pictures. I got them before, too late actually to be able to send them to Derek and include, but it was really cool. They're starting to see especially some upper story things coming in their main street and things like that. So these code changes are working, and it can be pretty subtle, practical things that don't have to change the nature of the place and can really work with the context and neighborhoods that you have. And, you know, our experience in Glenwood Springs has been that these things, you know, we build them. Again, here's an example that this was just about trying to be able to bring my mom into the same community I'm in. And it really works within the neighborhood. We only get compliments from the neighbors on the improvement in the space because it was so beat down before we brought this in there.
Thanks, Clark. So some of the other questions that kind of came up through the process here, there were some questions about homelessness and how homelessness kind of plays a role in our housing. So, you know, I think that's a really broad question, and I think we probably could spend a work session on homelessness. However, to kind of briefly summarize, I mean, we do have the highest poverty rate in the state at 17.3%, and what we're hearing from our community partners that work with these populations is homelessness is really well hidden in our community. And, you know, we're seeing people, you know, bunking with friends or too many people to a home, sleeping, you know, families in one room type of scenario that kind of hides what the impact that we're seeing. We're also seeing just sort of to kind of try to put some numbers to it. When we were talking with our community partners that do work with this population, you know, last year we had 54 families through kind of the schooling system that we knew that were homeless, and individuals were not counted in that number. But what our agencies told us is that we've got thousands on the edge of homelessness in terms of probably right on that brink of, you know, losing a few hours of their work, to a car breaking down, to then putting themselves into homelessness. So I think what I would say is homelessness is an issue within our community, and it is something that does impact our housing, because it's that probably lowest end of the economic scale in terms of people looking for housing. And if we don't have housing choice for everyone else, we probably don't have housing choice for someone at the lowest end. We had another question just about who can afford the current housing prices. I think that's a difficult question to answer as well completely, but remember the U.S. Census Bureau recommends that about 30% of your income being spent on housing. And when you look at that as a kind of a benchmark, and you're thinking about rents around the $400 to $700 range, and home purchasing at $80,000 to $130,000. That's very, very limited, if non-existent, within our community. We also note that in the housing study, we're estimating that in the for the $250 to $350 or to the $300,000 range is kind of where our workforce housing is considered affordable, although it's not necessarily ideal or based upon actually the salaries that we're seeing. We then got another question about kind of what are housing numbers we're seeing in Albany County. As you'll see, in 2018, they had 50 single-family units as well as modular units brought into the county. 2019, 63. 2020, they had 62 single-family and then some multifamily product, as well as currently through 2021, 48 single-family with 2 multifamily products. And one thing I would point out is, remember, this is all of Albany County. This is not necessarily just right here adjacent to the city providing housing that is convenient to City of Laramie residents or can serve the City of Laramie population. Secondarily, this is also places like Centennial, Rock River, some of your areas that have, cabins and things like that. So last thing I'll point out about this is the single family numbers are fairly similar to what we're seeing in terms of city growth, city house single family numbers as well. So fairly close. So with that, I'm going to turn over the next slides to Matthew Cox, the associate planner. He's going to kind of address the really broad question with a few slides of kind of what are some of the costs that we're seeing for things like water, sewer, permits, and things like that for developing a site. How does that really compare to some of our other communities? So with that, Matthew.
Hello, Council, Commission. So we took basically all of the permit costs, application costs, plant investment fees that it would take to build residential units within our town. And I would like to preface these numbers with this is what we found from these cities' websites. Places like Fort Collins that are a bit larger have a pretty complicated equation system, so we had to really define what that project might be. But as you can see on this slide, the building permit and plan review fee, we are basically exactly the same as Cheyenne through this whole process. Casper is less and Fort Collins is extremely higher. They did have a category that was just Fort Collins, just contractors, and that was much higher. With subcontractors and not just contractors, and that number was much higher than even the one you see in front of you. Next slide, please. Next is just kind of water fees, what it takes to hook a line up to a home or a multifamily unit. As you can see, Laramie is much smaller or much more affordable than Cheyenne. As far as Fort Collins go, their equation dictates that they have to calculate it based off of your lot square footage. We imagine that's due to irrigation or just more water usage. And so I took kind of your average size lot that you see within maybe the Tree District or the West Side or one of the original plats of the city of Laramie. I will say as soon as that lot is larger, that cost goes up pretty significantly, as well as if you're adding more units, you can add about $1,500 on per unit. Next slide, please. As far as sewer fee goes, yeah, you can see the numbers, of course, but we are higher than Cheyenne just slightly, but much lower than Fort Collins, pretty significantly. And so the next slide is basically taking all these and building a single family home with these, sorry, I apologize, I'm one ahead. This is like your planning application fees. So your site plans, preliminary, final plats, zoning amendments, conditional use permits. As you can see, Laramie is pretty flexible, especially in our site plans is a very typical application that you'll see a developer have to submit to do any exterior work, whether that's type 1 to type 3. And type 3 is full compliance with our code. Type 1 might be putting brick where stucco used to be or something like that. And so as you go down the line, our preliminary and final plat are also pretty comparable to Casper. I will also say, talking to Charles Bloom, now the planning manager at Cheyenne, they're currently going through the process of increasing their application fees. They do admit that they're pretty past due and increasing. I do not know what those costs will be, but we'll keep y'all updated. And so now the next slide, basically taking building permit, your typical water hookup, and your typical sewer hookup that it takes to build a single family home. And I use a 7,000 square foot lot just to make it easy for the Fort Collins equation, and $230,000 worth house. And you'll see that Laramie comes out low compared to Cheyenne and Fort Collins. The information for Casper was very difficult to find. I couldn't find it for plant investment fees. But I would like to point out that Cheyenne and Fort Collins are booming housing markets. I mean, from what I can tell, since I've been in Laramie back in 2010 and took a break, but both those markets have always been growing constantly, especially the Front Range, and which stands out to me that these building permit fees really aren't slowing development. That's not where you're seeing your issue in increasing housing quantity. So yeah, those are my slides. Thank you.
So kind of jumping back into some of the other questions, we had a question that was a little more specific about, Cheyenne and Fort Collins and requiring for development and what's required. First off, the comment about development's a really broad question. We could really be talking about anything from, developing a subdivision, so thinking about putting in roads and water and sewer lines and things like that, to just physically constructing a single family home. And here's what we generally found, without spending a whole nother work session on it, is what we're seeing is the standards in Cheyenne are generally less restrictive. And in Fort Collins, the standards are generally more restrictive related to development. So think like subdivisions. For site development projects, we have a similar pattern. Fort Collins is much stricter. Cheyenne has less restrictive standards. But one thing that we really noted, and Matthew basically alluded to the fact, is that really, despite those standards, we're seeing both Fort Collins and Cheyenne continuing to see population and housing growth that's far exceeds what we're seeing in Laramie. And so, like I said, this question can be pretty broad. We tried to kind of address it a little bit in those previous slides, but there are a lot of individual factors depending upon the property, the site, and what kind of development's being done. We had another question regarding makeup of out-of-state ownership. We used assessor's data, GIS analysis to find out. So you have 83% of the residential parcels are owned by Albany County residents. So, pretty local, maybe somebody from Rock River owns something in Laramie, something like that. 9% are owned by someone other than people in Albany County. And so, that could be, out of state or out of county residents, things like that. And 8% are not Wyoming residents. And so, just to help provide a little bit of perspective, the 8% is about 630 parcels. We had another question about, do we know what the rental registry or inspection program would cost, and where that money might come from? What I would say is that type of a program is variable. There's a lot of ways in which that program could be developed. There could be different requirements depending upon which direction would go. And so based upon that, obviously, the budget and what would be needed could vary depending upon the complexity. A few years ago, we did do some estimates. We believe that multiple full-time employees would need to be hired on to complete inspections on a kind of a 3-year cycle. And really, budget would either need to be allocated to fund those types of positions and programs, or you're going to be looking at trying to cover that through fees. We had another question about UW as a major employer in the community. Are they competitive in regards to salaries? What we found in the Thrive Economic Plan is that really our higher level positions seem very comparable, maybe sometimes being paid a little bit less than competing institutions, but pretty much most of the other positions across the board are not remaining competitive and are paid well below other institutions, similar institutions. We also found had a question about what would happen to our housing market if sophomores were required to be lived on campus. Currently, freshmen are required to live on campus at the University of Wyoming. They're housed in dorms or other student housing. We didn't find anything really specific and weren't able to get any calls back from the university related to the possibility of this, but we found that you've got 1,852 sophomores were enrolled in fall 2020. So, presumably if you did have a scenario where they were to live on campus, you would have that same number not living within other types of housing within the community. Overall, yes, it probably would affect our off-campus and our housing in general across the board. But also, too, it's only about a quarter of the student population, so you'd still have half that student population living somewhere within the community. Another question about, are we appropriately zoned? Do zoning district changes need to occur? I think rezoning, overlay zones, any types of zoning changes are obviously a tool that we could use to help address housing. The text changes that we're proposing are changes specific to the zoning districts that already exist and are intended to provide flexibility in the current zoning districts that we have. At this point, we haven't explored that very intensely in terms of new districts, overlay districts, or things like that, but it definitely is a tool that we should consider and think about as we continue to move forward. Census numbers are coming soon. This was kind of the second question is, will the census affect what we do? I think they're going to be important in helping us further evaluate what we're going to do next. What types of population changes are we seeing? Did we see any demographic changes or income changes that could affect how we or where we might want to address housing? And that'd be something we would want to look at as we get those numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. So with that, we started to kind of really, that was kind of the main questions I would say we received from Council and Planning Commission that we thought we wanted to kind of really hit on and try to address based on information that we actually had. And so really, where are we at? What are we looking at actually implementing? Where do we think that we can see? What do we think we see in the next coming months? And so, as we kind of alluded to in our first presentation, really the code audit was something that we worked on with our community builders team to try to come up with tangible, kind of easy ways to potentially modify our codes that already exist, the zoning districts that already exist, to potentially open the door for housing options within our community. And so what you'll see is we kind of looked at a few different areas. The first one was the downtown commercial zoning district. And if you remember the last time that we looked at this, we've kind of checked these ones off. We increased and modified the height requirements. We changed commercial, and we changed the residential parking, and our commercial parking was already kind of on point in terms of what we wanted to see. And so what I would like to say is this is kind of a success, right? We've already taken those steps in our downtown commercial zoning district to address some of these needed changes to help bring housing into our downtown commercial zoning district. Next area was kind of related to parking, and for members of council and planning commission, we did bring some parking amendments forward earlier this last year. And through that process, we ended up not completing that process. We, though, believe that with this residential kind of geared, or the changes that we would like to see geared toward residential parking, we can bring forward a much smaller package. Really, from staff's perspective, it's going to simplify our parking requirements and reduce our parking requirements for especially multifamily development. Parking, as we know, creates a barrier in terms of driving up costs related to housing development. And so by reducing the required parking, we hope that it can potentially make projects more profitable and make projects more feasible for actual development. And so, when it comes to a timeline, staff's started to work on some of this, and we're fairly ready to move forward. And we hope that kind of through this process, we, hear some positive direction in bringing this forward eventually. The next section is going to be related to R2 and R2M codes. When community builders examine this, we really were focused in on the R2 zoning district, but I'll just preface, as we've been looking at this at a staff level, the R2M zoning district is extremely similar to the R2 zoning district, and the changes that we would be proposing in the R2 zoning district really make sense for the R2M zoning district, which the main difference between those two is in the R2M zoning district, the ability for mobile home parks to be incorporated into those zoning districts. And so probably as we move forward, we'll likely be proposing some changes to both those zoning districts because we think that they make sense and they're very compatible with each other and very similar to each other. And so as we started to kind of look at that, we also, are going to be looking at R3 changes. So the R3 and R2 zoning changes are really things that we're looking at, principal building requirements, minimum lot area, setbacks, dimensional standards, the ability to involve accessory dwelling units, modification to some of our townhome lots. And so what we thought would be helpful is kind of in this process, we're going to kind of show just a little bit of the examples of kind of what we're going to see potentially with these changes, specifically related to the code changes. The other thing I would point out too is that as we started to really dig into these changes at a staff level, we think we'll probably see a few other small recommendations in other sections of code that tie back to the, for instance, setback requirements and things like that. That'll simply need modifications so that they align with the changes that we would be proposing. And so, like I mentioned, one of the main changes that we're going to see in this zoning district is a change to allow for flexibility in the typology of our buildings. Right now, under our current code and the way the dimensional standards are written, someone with, for instance, a 6,000 square foot lot really has only one option if they want to maximize their density, which is all 6 units in one building. So one big, large building. But as with these code changes, what we're looking at is how do we allow for somebody to have flexibility in maybe what they want to provide in terms of the types of housing, where it's not really changing the density. And so kind of what we did is we just showed you some different options that with these code changes, Instead of today, all 6 units being in just one large building, which, for instance, in a residential zoning district that already exists, might not be very compatible next to a single family home, we can allow someone to build maybe 2 smaller 3-unit buildings, or a smaller 4-unit building at the front of the property and 2 units in the back, or maybe even 6 small bungalows that are maybe smaller than all the other houses within the area. So with this change too, what I want to make sure that council hears loud and clear is that through this process, we will be also opening up the opportunity for people that have existing properties, or maybe even nothing on a property within these R2 and R3 zoning districts, to have these multiple units, and which essentially will allow for what people kind of think in their minds about the ADU, the example that Clark gave about the house kind of on the back for the mom, or for a college student, or as a rental. That is going to be opened up through these changes. Next thing that we're going to be modifying and making a recommendation to modify is minimum lot area per unit. If you remember in the first presentation, we kind of showed you a pie chart of how inefficiently we were using our current zoning districts, and this is where this change will be largely helpful. And with this change, what we're going to see is smaller lots. And what we try to do is just show you some scale, a city block, where our current code requires for 4 units, for instance, in an R2 zoning district, 14,000 square feet. And then as we move forward, amending the process to allow for, 4 units to be on 5,000 square feet, and then also allowing for just simply smaller lots, maybe with only 1 unit at 2,500 square feet. The lot sizes, the 5,000 and 2,500 already exist in our community. You have properties on the west side and within the core kind of area of our community that have been chopped up multiple times and are in that 2,500 square foot range. And you'll find a lot of properties in that 5,000 square foot range. And so the key here is that we're going to allow for smaller lots to reduce that front end cost of, a smaller lot should in theory cost less. And so by starting out on the right foot in terms of less investment on the property, hopefully the product and the project that you can put on that makes more sense if you're looking to build your first home, for instance, or looking to do something on your property. Also, we're looking at changes to dimensional standards, and there's kind of two components to this. One's your traditional setbacks, and what I would say is this: is in our current zoning district, really your main changes to your setbacks are going to be your front setback. By modifying your front setback, you really are going to allow for just more usable space on the property, and as well as allowing your building to be maybe moved forward, so things like maybe parking can be accommodated in the rear of the site. If you look, parking or setbacks on your sides and your rear really aren't changing, and so really you're looking at mainly a front setback change. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is modifying some of our townhome requirements. Just for terminology in terms of the way our code is written, the city of Laramie considers a townhome as 3 attached units, where each unit has their own property, so they actually own the land, and they allowed access from kind of the street to the rear of the property. Right. What we're going to be proposing is allowing those lots to be a little bit more narrow, and by allowing them to be more narrow, more options and a more appropriate density for those 2 zoning districts, the R2 and R3 zoning district, can be achieved kind of based upon that same principle from before. And so I would say probably that change is probably going to be less substantial to the kind of the naked eye, I would say, but will really allow for potentially a unit or 2 more within the same space that we currently allow today. So then kind of with that, what I'm going to do is turn it now back over to Janine, where we're going to kind of talk about some of the next steps. And so what I just talked to you about is kind of one thing that, code changes, code audit changes. We know we can do that. We're prepared. We're ready to go. We have the data and the information. But what else do we have on the table that we need to start working on? And what do we want to see? And so with that, Janine.
So Derek and the planning staff obviously are preparing the material that Derek just described to you. You'll see that in the next weeks, frankly. I'm not sure if Derek has a date to initiate the first of the council's consideration for those code changes, but I believe late September, right, Derek? Yep. Okay, great. So we've touched on through the presentation some of these other future steps that we could take. And one of the notable ones that frankly I'm very intrigued by and I think has possibility for us is this notion of community-driven development, public-private partnership for housing construction. Council, we've danced around this a little bit, and I believe the Planning Commission is aware as well of that dancing around the edges of it work in the form of our visioning exercise for North 4th Street and the potential repurposing or reuse of the lands that our current city facilities are sitting on there. We'll be vacating those very aged properties probably within the next year, we anticipate, and so there is the potential for redevelopment there that could encompass housing. What I'd like to do tonight is just remind you of the public-private partnership opportunity, and the next slide will give you a little more detail about it. But I really think that that could form the basis for the third work session in this kind of series where we're unpacking all these housing issues, where we could really do kind of a deep dive in that next work session into public-private partnerships and get into a lot more detail. It'd be a little bit too much for tonight, I think, but we'll give you a little more information in the next slide. Other things that Derek has already touched on: rental quality improvement, preservation, registry inspection, some form of that. The council did bring this issue up a couple of years ago now. It is still an anticipated work session that you've had requested and wanted to pick up again in the fall and start really talking about what that might look like. Then of course there's the R1 code changes. We can talk about accessory dwelling units, setbacks, lot sizes. I'm not going to go into detail either there. That'd be a lot for tonight. We would further recommend you look at development incentives. This is something that for many, many years we have talked about here at the city, but we really haven't taken proactive steps to do that. Some of the conversation around that has circulated around, would we like to have a structured development incentive program? Or would you empower the city manager and certain members of staff to negotiate deals or development incentives specific to and relevant to and useful to any particular housing development that a private builder might bring forward, and then bring those to you on a sort of a case-by-case basis. There is the potential for new zoning districts, overlays, boundary changes, again, things that Derek and Matthew can go through with you in great detail in the future. We have talked about in the past, probably could talk about again, our mobile home park standards. I did learn recently just a tidbit of information I thought was timely that I came across last week, that a couple of our really prominent mobile home parks in Laramie have actually apparently recently been acquired by the same owner and are making some changes, increasing lot rents, going away from master metering at those parks into individual metering. And it's affecting pricing in that market. I don't know what that means. I don't know if the council even has the legal authority to exert any control in that manner, but it struck me as something that as a city, we would want to be mindful of, because mobile home parks have constituted historically for Laramie affordable housing. And if we start to see lot rents and utility rates go up in those arenas, that could really change the affordability factor for mobile homes. Our CIP program, I will tell you, we have historically tried to align the CIP to meet our economic development and housing objectives. And of course, I think we would continue to do that. So that's a good practice we have that it makes sense to continue doing. And then lastly, the council has mentioned a number of times that the council would maybe like to get a little bit more involved in this. We've had Councillor Harrington participating on some of our existing housing action team and housing council, but there is certainly opportunity as we move forward and take future steps to expand the council's role as we get really serious and really kind of more down in the trenches and doing hard work in this arena. There may be other things, and I would tell you at this point, maybe if you have other thoughts for future steps we could take, kind of jot those down. We'll unpack that in just a couple slides. So next slide. this is just a really quick and dirty overview of public-private partnerships and sort of what they look like. My office and the planning manager, over the years, we've been kind of cataloging ideas. We've cataloged what would I say, actual partnership structures from other nearby regional communities that maybe we could mirror or take a look at. We see North 4th Street, as I've said, as an opportunity area, physical area, as well as the Turner Track lots potentially. So that's a quick overview, but I think this is worthy of its own work session, perhaps, in coming weeks. Next slide. So let's talk about the council work group a little bit. Like we've said, we understand that you would like to maybe form a work group. Myself and Derek and Todd, we all talked about this, and this is something we understand is an immediate timeline, especially as we're getting real serious about this work. So we really want to pull the council in a more structured way. Yes, people call City Hall and the city manager's office, even at 7 o'clock at night. So let me turn that off. So we do have the Housing Action Team. We have the Housing Council. There's been a member of both Planning Commission and City Council participating in that. And we have used public processes consistently throughout that. I want to assure you of that. So really we conclude with that last bullet point. Does the council want to create a separate kind of council work group on housing? And I will tell you what I recommend, and then you guys can decide how you want to take that and what you want to do with it. I would recommend against forming like some separate work group amongst the council. I think it makes more sense to maybe if Councillor Harrington wants to continue his involvement, we add maybe 2 more people and have a 3-person council work group or even a 4-person council work group that we fold into our existing Housing Action Team, Housing Council, and work in a deeper sort of collaboration amongst the elected officials and our Housing Action Team, or we call them internally our housing rock stars. That's a lot of people from the private sector that work in the housing arena. So that's what I would recommend. We can certainly do it however the council would like to, but I think it makes good sense to pull council in a more structured and a more detailed way. So that's what we would propose for future steps, and that is our presentation. We moved through it more quickly than I thought we would, and I appreciate all of your patience. It is a lot of information, and we want to hear from you now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that did touch on a lot of stuff. Many of those points we've discussed before, some in more detail than others, but at least all of them have been addressed in past meetings. You see the email to the planning department, a phone number, and a link to the Thrive Housing Plan for folks that maybe don't have input now but might come up with some later, or members of the public that might want to add more than they can in just a public comment period this evening. I know that we had some public comment lined up already, and I imagine we're going to have some discussion about this amongst the Planning Commission members and the council members. So I'd like to just quickly check with the council members and the Planning Commission members if they'd be open to receiving those public comments that we have from folks that have signed up ahead of time now, and just make sure there's no objection to that. Yeah, okay, good. From what I can see, everyone's feeling good about that. So let's do that. And City Clerk, I have a hand raised, the hand icon raised for Melody Roberts. But I also remember from the beginning of the meeting, City Clerk, you had said that we had a different individual signed up ahead of time.
Yeah, Sarah Roberts wanted to make a public comment.
So why don't we go ahead and recognize Sarah Roberts and welcome, and thank you for being here and taking some time out of your evening to share your thoughts with us. You have the floor.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me? Perfect. So I wanted to say hello, Mayor and City Council. I would like to bring up the need for building and fire codes to address our rental problems. Affordable housing should also come with proper codes for health and safety. Renters have rights. However, I was told by the building inspector's office that Laramie has grandfathered in landlord policies that make it difficult for a renter such as myself to find a place that is up to code. Landlords know that these laws are grandfathered in and take advantage of vulnerable students and renters needing a place. So the conditions of their dwellings are as is, and that is not right. Renters deserve to have safe living conditions and up to code homes. The place before the one I was living in now was not up to code. For example, I was living in a basement apartment, and in case of a fire, the window in my home was cocked shut. And I was told that the fire marshal and building inspector was not able to come check my living conditions because of these grandfathered laws, because I was not the owner of the residence. I feel that these policies should be changed, because if we do not do something, you're going to have a situation like the one in Florida. This should not be about money. It should be about the welfare, safety, and health of renters. If we do not change, it is only a matter of time before renters get seriously injured, sick, or worse, die because of the unsafe conditions like the one I was living in. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Let's go to Melody Roberts. And you have the floor. Thanks for being here.
Can you hear me, Council?
Yes.
Melody Roberts at the computer. My name is Steve Roberts. I am Sarah's dad, and I just wanted to say thank you, Council and Mayor, and the planner and everybody for listening to us. But I would just like to also ditto what my daughter said. The conditions that she was living in there by one of the landlords was just terrible. There was mold. She had stuffed up in the vent. She was storing paint in where the water heaters were, all this stuff. And when we tried to go get a building inspector or something, they said they could not go in there because they were grandfathered in. And so I would just like to, like she said, one of these days, somebody's going to get hurt in one of these places. I think they need to change the codes that if somebody lives in there and they're renting a place, that they should be able to have somebody come in and inspect that and make these landlords stand up to the codes like everything else. Where you're looking at new buildings, the codes and everything for them, but I think the some of these places that are rented out, and I'm not saying all of them, but the one we were in was just unlivable. And I think some of these conditions should be looked at. If you could please do that. And we were told when we went to the building inspector's office by the planner Matthew that this would be the place to address it. So we're here at the council meeting just to let you know that please, if you could, look at this and maybe address this later before somebody does get sick or hurt in one of these dwellings. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate that you let us come on here and say things. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to be here. Share those views. Do we have anybody else that would like to make a public comment at this time? You can raise your hand using the Zoom. Okay, great. I'm going to recognize Linda Devine. Welcome. You've got the floor when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for the presentation. I specifically appreciate you wanting to address affordable housing. I also appreciated addressing the homeless population in Laramie. I think it is something that that hidden secret in our community. But echoing what the two previous speakers discussed is the landlord issues here in town and the safety a lot of these rental properties are. I get calls at least once a week from folks concerned about their housing conditions. I can only represent so many people for free, and it's hard helping folks and dealing when they have to go in and file lawsuits, try to get out of a lease. And I know it's brought up to council before, but I would urge you as you're doing these housing plannings to consider the way that the landlords, many landlords in this community are treating their property. We have renters here that have a right to health and safety in their housing. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you. We appreciate your time. Other public comments? They don't all have to be made now, but this would be a good time because they might inform some of the discussion amongst the council and members of our planning commission. Yes, I'd like to recognize Josh Watanabe from the Interfaith Good Samaritan Agency. Welcome, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mayor Weaver, council members and members of the Planning Commission. We're just here to listen and learn. We've provided some input to the planners earlier this week, and we hope to be a continued part of this discussion. I recognize that we are addressing what amounts to somewhat of a small portion of this issue as presented, but I'll be reaching out to you, and again, we appreciate you taking on this massive issue, and hope to continue to provide input. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me just suggest to you that I think your agency is going to be a very important part of this discussion, and not a small one. So we appreciate your attention and the time you've dedicated to it. Yeah, thank you very much. Call for public comment one more time, although not the last time. Council and commission members, I don't have any hands up at the moment. So at this point, I'm going to close that first section of public comment and open it for comment from council and commission members. I'm going to go in order. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit patient with me because we have a few people on here. Here's who I have so far for their first time. Councilmember O'Doherty, followed by Councilmember Harrington. Councilmember O'Doherty.
Thank you. I was wondering, I just have a few questions I just want to throw out there. I don't necessarily need answers now, but one was, can you remind me what CIP stands for? It was in one of the slides. When I saw it in the slide, I knew what it meant, but then when city manager mentioned it later, I didn't have the slide as a reference. So,
Mayor, if you'd like, I can answer that.
Yep.
Council, I'm sorry, all of our little acronyms that we use, it is Capital Improvement Program. So Council and Planning Commission, this is whereas we plan water, sewer, road improvements, or new construction of any of those elements in our Capital Improvement Program, we try to align those with, for instance, the comprehensive plan and areas of the community where we've already identified and planned for housing growth to occur or business growth as it may be. And then we will be strategic in spending our money, our city money, to lay infrastructure to expand housing or business or things of that nature. A good example would be what we call our Northside Tank project. We have in excess of $10 million, largely grant-funded project to bring water to the area currently north of the city limits, where we know we have housing development ready to occur and developers ready to build houses if we just can bring them water and some sewer capacity and some storm drainage. So that project's been in progress now for about 4.5 years. We'll be under construction this year, so that's pretty exciting. But that would be where we're aligning CIP with where we want to see housing. Thanks for the question, Councilor O'Doherty.
Mr. Mayor, can I thought that was going to be just tell me what the acronym was. So may I ask my other questions, or is that okay? Wyoming has the highest number of vehicles per capita as of 2024 of any other state. And we've gotten complaints about the Ward 3 councilors got a letter yesterday complaining about all the vehicles, the trailers, the RVs and stuff on the street. So I can see reducing parking when you have a really big development because not everybody has a car. But I've noticed the fourplexes, the lots are pretty full and they spill into the street. So I just want to mention that. And then I was wondering, is there any chance that Wyotech, maybe Councilor Schuster knows, would have a construction track that would help us with, people to swing hammers? Thanks. Actually, they're using nail guns, but thanks. That's all my question.
Well, I suppose we'll open it up for questions among and between council members. Councilmember Schuster, would you like to answer that question? You don't have to.
I would like it answered one more time. Or asked one more time, because I really was unsure what she was asking for.
I think what she asked was if in the near future Wyotech planned on having a construction program track in line with some of their expanded programming we've heard about lately. Is that correct, Councilmember O'Doherty? Was that the question?
If that was the question, at this time we are not looking at housing construction. We have several programs we want to bring online, but every time you bring on a program, people don't understand. You don't just say, all right, next month we're going to open up a welding shop so you can become a certified welder. You have to get certified by every state that you're going to bring students in from. So when we say we're going to bring a new program on, it usually takes about 2 years to bring a program on, because we have to get it certified by, if a student wants to come on from that state. Right now, we've got basically almost every state in the union. We don't have all of them. And we have about 3 countries that have signed on that they will send students to us. So it's a lot different than what most people think, to have the ability to say that. I know in Denver, there is such a construction shortage, skilled workers. They have free programs that you can go and attend a class for free on how to frame a wall, how to frame a window, how to frame a door, because the construction companies are put these on to try to get, I don't want to say halfway skilled laborers, but to get someone that knows how to swing a hammer, drive a nail, how to frame out a window, that they're putting those classes on for free down there, just hoping that they can recruit you to their contracting crew. It's amazing right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Schuster. Councilmember Harrington.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a series, but I'll just stick with one for the first round since there are so many people. I'm assuming that's what you would hope for.
Actually, Councilor Harrington, I think I'd prefer everybody sort of get them out.
Oh.
I think.
All right, buckle in, everyone.
Otherwise, it might even go longer. So okay. Go ahead.
Sure. So first off, I would just say I would be happy to continue and would enjoy having some other colleagues on the housing meetings, but I would be happy to continue if you all will have me. Just off the top, the first real question. So Derek, you mentioned having a bigger view as we discuss all of this, and I think that was pertaining to your graphic with the circles. And so one of the things I've been thinking as we go through that, I've been trying to keep that in mind. And one of the things that I was thinking is how many of these pertain to rental units. And I understand the majority of units in Laramie are rentals, so it does make sense. But I'm curious, noting sort of the larger trends in home ownership with the decline in younger generations, but starting to be an uptick in desire to own homes. I think what we're really seeing is a generation being kept out of long-term wealth generation. So we're watching, I think if we do this wrong, we're watching an entire generation be unable to really build long-term wealth and be forced into renting long-term. And so, with that in mind, some of the things that we are discussing, I'm not sure how they would pertain to purchasing homes. When you talked about shrinking lot sizes, I'm not sure if that is specific to the 2,500 square foot lot. I live on that lot right now. I am zooming from that size lot as we speak. my house is great, and it's an entry-level home. It doesn't hit even with the higher end of what that affordable housing sort of threshold is, but it's a whole lot closer than the majority of the homes in Laramie. And so I'm curious how we can use our code to enable some smaller homes to be built that are attainable for purchase, not for renting, because I think what we're seeing in the purchasing world is people who own homes refinancing or continually rolling their money around and purchasing more and more and more homes. And so then we run the risk of adding ADUs and doubling their investment for them, and really, in my mind, not reaching what could be one of the bigger issues here. So it's my first question. It's not an easy one, but I'm curious about those lot sizes for purchase.
Mr. Teeny, if you want to take a crack at it, go for it.
Would love to, Mayor and Council. So, first off, with the changes that are being proposed, they are going to affect the market both for home ownership and for rental. And so I think to say that it's one or the other, that's definitely not going to be the case. Secondly, I would say that sorry, I've got a phone ringing in the office space here. So secondarily, what I would say is that by providing flexibility in what can be produced, what I think we're doing is we're going to be able to provide the option for at least the ability to purchase maybe a home at a lesser value or rent a home at a lesser value because maybe it's on a smaller lot. Now, yes, you're right. You will have some people, whether it's a homeowner who wants a secondary income maybe in their backyard because their yard's big or that's what they want. You will see that people using that as an option. The other thing too, if you remember, if you looked at some of the materials that we provided early on in this process and kind of prior to the presentations, some of these extra units on properties are a real efficient way for people within the community to move up in their housing needs by using some of these extra units as we call them a mortgage helper. And what the effect of that is by providing some additional income, it allows them to kind of advance out of maybe, let's say, their starter home or the duplex that they're in into maybe a single family home that meets their needs at whatever time period they're in. Also, as you heard Clark mention earlier on in the presentation, he gave you an example of kind of the reverse of that. So seasoned in his career, has a place he wants to be, a community he wants to be. His mom is aging out of her community and he wants her close by. Our codes don't allow for that right now to provide that option. And yeah, through these changes, you are not going to keep maybe let's say a landlord who just simply is there to earn money on as a business from maybe putting that additional unit in the in the rear of their property. However, I would challenge you and say too as well, we know we need that housing, whether it's the landlord doing it, the single family property owner doing it, or potentially just one person who owns a couple pieces of property in this town doing it. We're providing more choice, and it's choice that we don't have in our community right now. And so what's happening is people are either spending too much money on their housing, leaving the community, or just simply not having the option to do it and then having to make some of those difficult decisions about moving, maybe taxing themselves in terms of how much they're spending on housing. And so very, very, very big picture, some communities, when they do build in projects that maybe they work with a partner, so in those kind of that public-private partnership scenario, maybe parts of those public-private partnerships are restricting, how that potential income raises so that those units stay affordable for a longer period of time, which allows for, entry into home ownership in some capacity or another. And so that's a broad question, but I mean, there's also, there's pros and cons to it a little bit.
Yeah, and Mr. Mayor, I'm not opposed to the ADU conversation, and I think for all the reasons you just listed, I think it is probably a good direction for us to look at moving. I think, frankly, they'll all be new construction, so they will be at least built to current building codes, and I think that will do a lot to assuage some of the higher consequences of the rental market that we heard about from public comment earlier. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, though. I assume you could not sell an ADU if you built one on the back in your large yard, even if you had a 6,000 square foot lot and you wanted to build a small ADU off the back. You wouldn't be able to do that. And I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we have smaller lots that are available for purchase? Can we build bungalow communities that are all available for purchase for people who are looking for a specific type of home? I suspect in the example of, just ignore the crying baby, in the example Clark gave, had his ADU situation not have worked out, might have been a great place for his mom to move, where she would have neighbors close by. She doesn't have a yard to maintain. There's a lot of pros and cons to that. Would those be available for purchase?
Mayor and council. So yeah, the changes that we're proposing is going to open that door, because right now the door is you have to have a 6,000 square foot lot. So if you want to go build a new house, minimum 6,000 square feet, even if you want a small bungalow on it, that's 600 square feet, right?
Right.
But not efficient use of the property. Also, with these changes, you will get probably more properties that may go from 1 unit to 2 units, right? So someone does put that ADU in the back of their property. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to sell that separately. They may be able to condo it if it's something that they were looking at, but probably what you'll see in the future is that property being sold with 2 units on it, right? Whereas though, with some of these changes, what I think we're going to see is flats and subdivisions come forward in a smaller lot configuration. Maybe it's not even at the smallest size. Let's say 4,000 square feet with a 2,000 square foot lot. I mean, what you're seeing is for every 2 lots that you're getting basically a bonus lot every time you plat 2 lots based on 4,000 square feet. Whereas today you have to do the 6,000 square feet, and you're going to gain more opportunity to put more homes in. And as a developer, that's often a good thing. But also, like you mentioned earlier on, is it does allow for that person to maybe get into a project that's maybe a little bit cheaper, but it might be on a smaller lot, more like what you're living in today, maybe, right? So these changes will allow for home ownership of smaller properties, which we think is good.
Great. And Mr. Mayor, if I can just keep rolling, I just have a couple more. So I'm curious, are we seeing, so when we discuss the fees, I'm trying to figure out the purpose of the slides about the fees, other than to say like our fees aren't too high, which I think is great information. If that's not the case, where we're seeing, like, if it's not fees that's preventing growth or building in Laramie, is there somewhere more concrete that you can point that is causing the, where's the bottleneck in our building? If it's not, I mean, that would be an easy one, right? Like that'd be the easiest one to fix, but of course it's not that.
I think the purpose of those slides was twofold. One, let's put the conversation to rest that, fees are driving away development, right? Okay, boom, that's put to bed. The next part of it is, okay, where's the bottleneck? I mean, I think you have to go back to that second slide that we talked about in this presentation. Is unfortunately we don't have that silver bullet where I can tell you the bottleneck in construction is A, B. And what we've got is like A through Z. We have high land costs. We have, lack of people swinging the hammer, like was mentioned by Member O'Doherty. We have high construction costs right now. We have lack of materials within the community. I mean, there's all this series of things that have compounded into creating this issue where, why we're not getting that. And, you know, like I said, the code changes and some of those things are some of the things that we as a municipality that we have full control of. So I think we can make some of those changes in that direction.
City Manager, do you want to chime in on this question?
Thanks, Mayor. I would a little bit, and I offer this to City Council in particular because you see when things come to a head, where we have developers who, you know, I've seen this time and time again over the years, as have you. We have a housing developer who may want to put in a subdivision. And oftentimes where we seem at a crossroads and things come to a head is when that developer is in front of City Council. And often what they're balking at is really the requirement to put in public infrastructure along with those houses, roads, water, and sewer. And we see this time and time again. So I don't want to lose sight of that because that is, you know, where the rubber meets the road in front of the elected officials. I would offer you this, and if Derek or if our community builders friends with perspective from nearby communities want to weigh in, I'd welcome it. But, you know, this is a conundrum for staff because it is not at all atypical. It's in fact quite normal in my experience for cities to require developers to build that public infrastructure and then dedicate it to the public. But it seems to me we have maybe a scale issue where a lot of our home builders that have traditionally built in Laramie, they're not of sufficient size to bear those costs, frankly. And so, you know, when they find out, you know, I needed, you know, 20 million to build this subdivision. Oh, and now I didn't realize I needed to build streets and put in water and sewer, and that's going to add 5 or 6 million on. Those costs maybe because these aren't huge builders, the kind of builders you find in urban areas that build 150, 200, 300, 400 home subdivisions. They're just not capitalized maybe for those costs. But the candid answer is it's not atypical in my experience for cities to require this. It's in fact normal. And I don't really know how we attract developers or home builders who really have that economy of scale to bear the cost of that public infrastructure. And as you know, during the budget, you know, the city has almost the same general fund now that it had 12 years ago. We also don't have spare dollars to put out there to take that cost off of the developers. So to me, that seems like a real issue that we have, and I don't know a good solution to it other than recruiting folks with more maybe capacity and debt and lending opportunity.
Thank you. Councilmember Harrington.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, City Manager. That is good context. So I'm going to roll in I had a few other questions, but I think they can all be just lumped together for everyone else to have a chance to talk as well. So on the incentive program, I sort of like both options, City Manager, that you discussed of empowering staff to be as flexible as possible and negotiate as feels necessary. But I do like the idea of providing some certainty in incentives to developers and builders. I think that would be valuable in them planning their projects to sort of know what the baseline is, and then if they require or are able to justify further incentives, I think it would be great for us as a city to do what we can to make it work. And I think in a lot of ways that is not dissimilar to the way in which we engaged with the sort of the local business community in response to the pandemic. I think the sort of like start with yes and then figure out how to get there approach. You know, it's not lost on me that there was really one sidewalk seating area in downtown prior to the pandemic, and now there's a half dozen, maybe more. That is the city staff saying yes and figuring out how to get to yes around our code. I think that sort of like spirit of the code, less letter of the law, I think that's something that maybe we could use a little bit more in housing. So less of a question, I suppose, unless somebody has an answer to it, and I won't do the don't you agree thing. So save you from that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Harrington. And again, I would encourage people to get their question out in the first round of questioning and only follow up if they need to, simply because it's important to conversation. We have a lot of people here. Councilmember Gabriel, you've been waiting, and I thank you for your patience. You're up.
Thanks, Mayor. First off, a big thank you to the Planning and Zoning Commission members for all of your time that you have spent on lots of city issues and for your service to the citizens of Laramie. I know that you put in a lot of time, and I think from the council standpoint, we really appreciate that. So thank you for your time and efforts. Matthew and Derek, I know that you've put together a presentation here tonight that is really, as Councilor Harrington has talked about, you know, there's so many complex issues. We've been talking about the multifaceted problems that housing is all across the country. And I think you're right on the, you know, you're on this a good track to incentivize these builders to hopefully do a little bit better job of getting housing complete here in the city of Laramie and Albany County. I was just curious, Derek, maybe if you could answer, and you probably cannot answer the question on that housing study, that 4106 additional units by 2030 with some of these proposed changes that you're talking about in the code. How close do you think we can get to that?
Mr. Tooney, look into the magic 8 ball for us. Yeah.
My magic 8 ball is fuzzy right now, Member Gabriel. You know, I think what I would say, and I don't think I can give you an answer, obviously. I can't give you an exact number of, like, you know, we make these changes, we're going to see a 10% increase in, you know, housing related to this type. What I think I can say definitively is that with the changes, we at least open the door for people to have flexibility and doing something that's different that we can't do right now. And what I would say is we're moving the needle in the right direction versus making it more difficult or creating more hurdles or more restrictions, or however you want to look at it, that could potentially make the needle go the wrong direction. And I think with any of the changes that we talk about more immediate or in the future, I think that's always kind of got to be the big vision, because it goes back to, we don't have the silver bullet. We can't just change 2 things in our code and then all of a sudden all of our problems are solved. What we're going to have to do is keep things trending the right direction through changes, incremental changes in different areas, whether it's code, the private sector, financing, whatever it is, to start to drive us in the right direction and get us to this, you know, start moving that way. Otherwise, you know, we're not gonna, you know, we're just simply not gonna be able to do it. And that number is a big number. It's, you know, we're behind, right? So I think that's got to be the focus, is moving us in the right direction versus the opposite direction.
Thank you very much, and great presentation tonight.
Any other questions or follow-up, Councilmember Gabriel? Okay. Councilmember Schmeckel?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, thank you for the wonderful presentation here this evening. I'm curious if we're reaching out across the hill to the Next Generation Sector Partnership over in Cheyenne that's built around construction, that takes a industry viewpoint rather than a governmental viewpoint at things, and seeing if there's overlap, or if there's ways we can get an economy of scale to solve some of these problems or get a different perspective on them, and making sure that we're looking at this from many angles as we have access to.
Councilmember Schmeckel, did you have a particular staff member you wanted to direct that?
I just couldn't find the mute button.
Go ahead,
Again, you know, the classic problem. You know, I think these are the comments that we want to hear, because I think that's another, you know, it's a solution, another solution, and maybe addressing one component, which is that construction component. And I think during the Thrive plan, I know that was somewhat discussed about how do we partner with groups that are doing any type of this industrial trades, construction trades. And so I think that that's going to be something, we definitely will want to look at that, because as both Janine and I have mentioned, we're lacking the people to swing the hammers. Even if we've got the land available or the opportunity available, only so many people can actually build the house. We can only get so many houses being built, right? So I think that's a great recommendation.
Okay. Councilmember Schmecker, do you have any follow-up on that or other questions you want to ask at this time?
Thank you. No, I'm good.
Okay. Councilmember Somerville.
Thank you, Mayor. My question really centered, I've got two questions. The first one is, in adding these ADUs in the R2 and R3 areas, some of those are the oldest parts of town. Is adding another dwelling unit, even a small one, going to, is our infrastructure significant enough for that in those areas? Water, sewer, all of those pieces?
Mayor, Councilmember Somerville, I mean, the general answer is yes. I mean, adding another single family resident in most of our community is not going to be an issue. And I think this question kind of came up in Planning Commission during our presentation. And what I pointed out though is we do have some areas that we have deficiencies in our infrastructure that potentially something like this wouldn't work. Overall, I would say that adding a single unit, things like that are not going to be as impactful as what you might see if you see a full greenfield development. But the other thing that I would say is an encouraging piece of the puzzle is that our Public Works Department over the last 10 years has put significant money and time into analyzing our system, both water, sewer, and stormwater systems, which are, I'm just going to say, those are your kind of three main, systems, that public infrastructure systems that we as a community, the developers have to rely on to function for their actual development. And through those plans and those studies, we've identified areas. We know the areas that potentially have problems. We've had projects be delayed because of some of those bottlenecks or lack of infrastructure, but we do know where they're at. We can, in some cases solve those if certain projects are coming in, but then also too, for the most part, I think most of our areas where we might see something like this, we can accommodate it. Also too, in new development areas, so let's say like a new development that maybe does a smaller lot subdivision that has just more units in it, that new infrastructure will be able to handle it based upon the way we build and standards that we require for putting that infrastructure in initially.
I appreciate that. Thank you. The second question that I have is really around the potential for R1 changes. Related to ADUs and setbacks and all of the same things that have been recommended in the R2 and the R3. Is there a reason we're not bringing the R1 changes forward at the same time? I'd hate to get in a situation where we made these changes to R2 and R3 but didn't make similar changes to R1.
So at the beginning of the presentation, I kind of mentioned when community builders and staff really were looking at at potential changes, we kind of were, what's the best bang for our buck, right? Where can we see the most potential change based upon the changes that we might propose? And your R2 and R3 zoning districts and your downtown commercial zoning districts are the three zoning districts where we allow multifamily development, so more density than just one unit on a property. And simply by economy of scale and the fact that if we can add more density within those districts and if we make changes, we in theory should be able to allow for, more housing to come in, which helps us on our bottom line. Now the R1 zoning, we put it on the one slide. We wanted to bring it up. I think it's a discussion that we definitely probably need to have. We are seeing across the country communities taking a really, I would call it a proactive approach in terms of housing and simply eliminating R1 zoning, not even allowing single-family residential districts. So any district can have multifamily. But you're also seeing in other communities kind of more of an incremental change where you're seeing, for instance, the permissions to allow for an ADU within an R1 zone. Remember, our R1 zoning district says 1 unit on the property. But those are things that we're seeing across the country. We're seeing it in communities, and I think it's going to be, something, what I'm hearing is, maybe something that we want to consider. I would say, though, the changes are definitely a lot different than the R2 and R3 districts. Remember, the R2 and R3 zoning districts are currently set up to accommodate density and multiple units. Our single-family residential zoning districts aren't necessarily set up that way, and it would require more robust changes to probably get that, put together. But it's not impossible either. So.
I certainly appreciate that. My thought certainly with the R1 is, again, if we need to spread density out across the city and use the lots that we have available, that's certainly something to think about. But also with the prices of homes in Laramie right now, being able to construct an ADU on, a $450,000 home lot may make that actually affordable, where we don't have houses available in the other price tiers or whatever you want to call them. So that was my thought on that. Thank you.
Mayor, if you don't mind, just if you remember, for any members of council, the planning commission, public, within the housing materials that community developers put together, we called that the mortgage helper. That was a way in which it's a tool that you can use in a community to try to make prices a little bit more affordable by generating some income on your property, and you're associated typically with like a single family home or maybe like a duplex. So it's definitely something that we've built into kind of that thought process in this broader scope of housing for our community.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I forgot it was called a mortgage helper. I'll remember that next time. Thanks.
Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I only have one comment, and that's just to echo what Councilor O'Doherty mentioned in terms of parking, and the number of vehicles in our community compared to possibly other communities, surrounding communities, and kind of overall plans, when we compare ourselves to other areas. We have a population of folks who enjoy their toys, boats and campers and four-wheelers, and we also have a population of in this area that have multiple vehicles. And I think whatever we do and however we do it, we have to be very cognizant of that fact, and I don't want that forgotten, and we've echoed it as council a couple times. So when we think about these plans, and I think perhaps Councilor Cunby may want to jump in here as well, when we think about these plans, we need to provide potential space and area for storage of these vehicles, for just where to put some of these multi-purpose vehicles, because this town has a lot of them, and I doubt it's going to change in the near future, given our location and our real desire to be out and about. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Vice Mayor, that's an extremely salient point. If we don't want to obligate developers to provide parking spots, or we want to allocate space for garages, then that point has to be considered very, very carefully. Or we could take a different approach that you see other recreation-oriented communities in Wyoming take, which is that storage areas where those things can be parked are provided at a cost for the residents to store those recreational vehicles, the campers, trailers, and things of that nature. You do see that and other communities. And it's a very important conversation because otherwise they're going to end up on the street. And we've also heard about the popularity of that over the years here on the council. And stationary recreational vehicle parking is controversial. It tends to simmer below the surface, but it's there. So I think that's a really, really good point. Commission members, we've heard a lot from council members. It's also your time to shine here at this work session. Don't be shy. Are there some comments that you'd like us to hear or that you'd like to air here at this work session? If not, I'm going to move on.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Councilor Schuster had his hand up a long time ago.
Thank you. Did not see him. A lot of people on the screen. Let's go to Councilmember Schuster, and then my previous comment stands. Councilmember Schuster, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Couple questions, because I know we have rentals torn up really bad right now. And I heard that we are, and this might be just a rumor, and I always like to confirm it, that we might be trying to hold off on some building permits on the northeast corner of town until we have our sewer flows so that we can adequately get rid of waste as much as bring in water. And there's not a day go by that someone doesn't contact me and says, can I build my own house? And the answer is, yes, you can. Under our guidelines we have, if somebody wants to be their own manager for a house they are living in, I believe they can do it. But when I give them a list of everything they have to do, it scares the living daylights out of them. Because yes, there are properties available in town to build on. Yes, you can purchase them so that you could build your own house, but your first thing you do is property. Then second, you got to get your water and sewer into the property before you even do one shovel work of dirt. And when they hear about all the different steps they need to do to build a house and how many different people they're going to hire, it just scares the living daylights out of them. Because there's several developers that have brought in subdivisions in and have lots for sale, because about half the subdivision initiated plans are that they're not going to build any houses there. They're going to sell them to contractors and stuff like that that are going to do a speculation or be contacted by someone to build there. So there's a lot in building a house. And I always joke about it. A very intelligent person, our former mayor, Joe Shumway, was the property manager for his own house and all the steps he had to go through to build his very nice house behind Slade School, or Indian Paintbrush, not Slade, Indian Paintbrush. I'm going to confuse those. But most people just don't know what it's going to take to build something. It's almost scary to them. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Tini.
Mayor, just to answer the question, so Member Schuster, there were sewer capacity issues located in Reynolds that have held up, I would say, plats. Thankfully though, the city had identified that before and had queued those up in our budgetary process and things like that, so that when these projects actually started to come forward, we had it already on our schedule. Otherwise, without a capital improvement program and knowing about these possible deficiencies, what happens is then they have to wait for us. And that's where you see pretty significant problems. Right now we've got in kind of that northeastern portion of town, we've got a couple projects kind of going through the process so that they're ready for when that capacity is opened up, which will be this fall.
All right. Looking for hands. Yeah, Councilor Cumby.
And just to build on a comment by Councilors Harrington and Pierce, and that also reflects conversations I've had with persons in the community. I think the move toward the smaller lots has the potential to provide housing for more lower income or beginning professionals. And if you read some of the literature related to generational trends, some of the young professionals are preferring smaller lots, new smart homes. They want smaller homes, smaller lots, things that are easy to manage. And thinking on top of that, I would like to see a move toward, as we're looking at our community as a whole, to think about areas where we could have more intentional development rather than site development here, there, ADUs behind houses, and kind of filling up the current space, to look at how we're going to develop space that is available to us and to move in that direction of building communities that may have mixed use. And as Councilor Pierce was talking about, that communities where you don't necessarily park on the street, that there might be a utility storage area, but that it's well thought out, and that we bring in developers that are looking to develop neighborhoods rather than spot development and a duplex here, an apartment there, and an ADU there, and stuff like that. I think it would appeal more to young professionals. And my question that I have is, they've looked at this problem for quite a while in Park County, in the Teton-Jackson area, and they've developed a number of strategies to help them achieve a goal of maintaining 65% of their workforce in the community. And one of the things that they did in order to do that was to form a community housing trust, where as homes became available, smaller homes, this trust bought those up, and then individuals, professionals in the community would be able to purchase that home and live in it, but when they were ready to sell, it goes back to the trust. And I wonder, have we investigated how they set this up, and if this might have any kind of application for our own community?
Mayor, I'm happy to take that question. So, Councilor Cumby, we are aware of some of the work that Jackson has done, and they're certainly the most progressive in the state because they have the most pervasive and serious housing affordability issues in the state, for all the obvious reasons, right? I will say there was legislation passed in the 2021 session that Derek and I and Todd are still kind of trying to wrap our head around. But the sort of prevailing wisdom right now is that that legislation will preempt cities from engaging in some of the activities, at least, that Jackson has historically engaged in to create affordable housing. So I guess the first thing I would say is we are aware of those kinds of efforts, and our housing plan, the 2015 plan, and I think our subsequent 2020 plan did identify that, you know, maybe we could become very aggressive, really. You know, we could create a local housing authority. We could create programs like you've mentioned that you see in Jackson, or you see in Boulder, other parts of the region. But we need to understand that legislation. And then the other thing I would say, if the legislation has not preempted local governments from those efforts. Then we also would want to be mindful of I guess, creating a whole new administrative arm of the city. It doesn't mean we can't do it, but it's certainly complex. And so our preference had been, and we mentioned this just briefly at that last meeting, our preference really had been to reach out to the Cheyenne Housing Authority, who, although they're called Cheyenne, they actually include Laramie in the area that they work in, and see if we could partner with them to look at programs like that as our first and best maybe way of doing that, most efficient way potentially, absent or in lieu of the city like really creating its own sort of municipal housing authority or district or something. So just some background. I know that's all over the place, but we definitely need to do more due diligence to understand what the change in legislation means for cities.
Thank you, City Manager. I appreciate that. And I just had one other comment to make, if I may, Mr. Mayor. I have a short-term rental, an apartment, and I won't name the company that I work through, but many of my guests, and I've mentioned this before, many of my guests, a frequent comment that I get from guests is around the lack of retail available, of more expanded retail for shopping. And I do get that comment, and I just wonder if sometimes our limited commercial retail that we have here somewhat impacts the desirability of our community.
Councillor Cumbie, I'll just react to that quickly. I think you're probably correct. And in our own retail study that we did a few years ago, and our ongoing work and contract with the retail coach to assist us with retail recruitment, I think you're correct. And I think that the retail coach who consults all over the country would agree with that as well. What I can tell all of you is we've been working really hard on this for 3 or 4 years. And we're seeing the fruits of some of that labor around town. I won't name names of businesses, but you can look at Grand Avenue and the UW Plaza. A number of those new retail opportunities that we see there were seeded by the work of the city, and we're really hopeful that we're going to have something really cool to bring to the community soon with respect to the old Kmart building. And Derek and I actually just met with the owners of that building 3 weeks ago now. So we're working to improve that, but I also have to give some kudos and nods maybe to Main Street, because I don't know, it's just my feeling, but a lot of my family and friends who seek retail therapy when they travel, they don't necessarily want to go to the same old chain store that's in their town. They want that sort of boutique shopping experience that we have, I think, downtown. And I think Main Street is doing a good job of promoting that. So yeah, I think there's room for improvement, but there might also be room for just like tooting our own horn a little bit on the sort of boutique shopping.
Thank you, City Manager, and I do try to promote that and inform my guests of what is available here.
Thank you, Councilmember Cumbie. Before I get into second speaking, if you have not had a chance yet, I invite you again to weigh in on the topic. Mr. Moody, I see you've turned your camera on, raised your hand. Go ahead, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Derek, is there an abundance or a shortage of developable land within, let's say, around the edges of the the city service boundaries?
I would say that's kind of a loaded question, right? So in one aspect, I mean, I would say that, Laramie as a community, we have room to grow, right? We don't have federal lands blocking us in. We don't have an ocean on one side of us, or large bodies of water or rivers or things like that. So that's, that works to our advantage. We have some topographical things that maybe create some complexities in providing water, sewer, things like that. As we've mentioned a couple times now, the city and our capital improvement program is really focused on where to expand, where to grow. Some of our infrastructure that we're going to be putting in is going to at least make the availability of open land serviceable by our infrastructure, like water and sewer. And one thing, think north of town, some of our areas south of the kind of built out town. Because development is so driven from the private side of things, there are people that own land that is ready for development, but they're not ready to develop. So they may not be, putting their land into the ability of platting it, subdividing it, putting in homes, things like that. So we have some of that working against us where people aren't doing something with it. Also too, when we start really taking a more detailed look, we've got county growth at the edge of the community that honestly is creating a barrier. It's probably going to be unlikely we'll grow in certain areas because we've seen some of those, I'm going to call them, your kind of 5-acre ranchette right against the city of Laramie. And with statute changes at the state level that have restricted our input and ability to help be in that process, that simply just occurs and it creates a barrier. And so, yeah, in some areas we're restricted. In other areas we do have room to grow. We have plenty of land to grow in, land-wise, acre-wise. It's whether that land comes in to development process in a timely fashion or the fashion that works for us, like in terms of like addressing housing needs.
Yeah, my question was kind of like, is there an opportunity to work with the county, given the politics that has changed a little bit, to facilitate that donut area, just to keep that opportunity in mind with the county, perhaps with the present commissioner situation. And then one other question, with respect to the comment by the public comment about unsafe rentals, and when I went to school, the student population, you lived in basements and you just sucked it up, and you spent 4 years living in some pretty nasty spots. And so, it seems like to me that UW should be very concerned and very willing to come to the table to talk about the rental situation, whether it's inspections to make sure that the off-campus students that are going to occupy these lower cost rentals are having a safe place to live. Again, UW has been problematic in cooperating with the city, but I think with respect to housing, and the fact that a third of the population is students and a lot of them are in the community, we just can't ignore the role that UW could or should play in cooperating with the city on the rental scene. I don't know how to do that. You guys have tried, I'm sure, but any insights into how to bring UW to the table on off-campus rentals would be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moody. City Manager, I saw you.
Mayor, I won't address the UW question, but Commissioner Moody, with respect to the county, the city and county have formed intergovernmental committee with this as a topic and a goal for the year to create or enter into some kind of memorandum of understanding with the city and county for how we would develop what we kind of commonly refer to as our high priority growth area, which are areas just outside of the city that our comp plan says should be developed and annexed into the city and on city infrastructure and city roads and all of that. And so this MOU goal that the council have established along with the commissioners hopefully will help us to work within the changes in law that Derek has alluded to, and come to agreement between the city and county on how we can develop the city out and not lock it in by 5-acre ranchettes that aren't on city services. And you certainly, Chris, you can't sort of jump the sewer line over that 20 or 10 or 5-acre sort of ranchette abutting the city. So and doing so is certainly very costly to the taxpayer and much more costly than doing it right the first time. So we're working on that, and that is a goal of the city. I don't know what to say to you, Deb. I'll leave that to people wiser than me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Moody, I won't for a second claim any more wisdom on this issue than anyone else, and certainly not the city manager or yourself, but I will say this. I think it's a prudent and timely question, and I think Mr. Tini touched on why in a couple of different ways. As to whether or not there's an opportunity to work on joint planning, I would just say, given that we've recently made some policy choices, we better hope so, because the alternative is to be landlocked with development completed at a totally different standard, which you see in other places in Wyoming, which has limited any city growth, as those communities have been ringed with county growth built to a totally different standard without respect to infrastructure or anything else. So that's why I think you're seeing some movement on that right now. And I think you're going to see that there are people in the community that are concerned about those exact same things. Other questions, comments? Mr. Townsend, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you. Go ahead.
Not a problem. Well, yeah, I would address the other side of that. Thank you, Mayor. I would address the other side of that in saying that, there is an environmental responsibility to think like, okay, cool, we have room, we can build out. Should we build out? The future of cities is building up, and the futures of cities is thinking about consolidation and respect to space, which is, I think, what the R2 and the R3 code changes would do. And I would echo a lot of some of the concerns that Harrington brought up, which was, how do we build more wealth for people in our 30s and 40s, right? And if we want our city to grow steadily, we have to think about investing in the people who have just enough wealth to give back to that community. So as much as I want us to think about moving out, I also want us to think about, we're not going to drive cars in 100 years, right? So like, how do we plan for that 50, 75, 100 year plan, and not just what feels good immediately? Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments and questions from commissioners or council members? Councilmember Harrington, second time.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, if there's nobody for a first left, I just had one more question about incentives. I don't know what the specifics would be, and I was hoping maybe someone from engineering would be on this call as well, because I think there might be avenues in the engineering department for this sort of flexibility as well. But in much the same way that we restructured how bonding requirements worked for development, I do feel like there is that same sentiment. I think there's probably more opportunity for that same sentiment to apply for incentives in other avenues, as far as when you construct which portion of infrastructure. Obviously, they all need to be completed by the time you receive your occupancy certificate. But in the lead up to that, maybe there's more flexibility. So I just wanted to see if there was any more conversation from staff, I guess, Mr. Mayor, on that portion.
Briefly through you, Mayor, Councilor Harrington. I would say this. I think we've made strides, certainly, in the last probably 7 to 8, 9 years. And here's why. Historically, we had underfunded our water and our sewer systems. And so about 10 years ago, we started the effort to get our water rates, to a level where we could actually replace failing water lines and do it on a really kind of normal, predictable, practical, and expected level. And what that did, the reason I mentioned that is because what that did when we allowed ourselves to kind of invest in the renewal of our system is it allowed us to stop pursuing grants for infrastructure renewal and instead pursue grants for building infrastructure proactively to facilitate and really direct where we want development to happen. One of the first projects we did after we adjusted the rates, and I know that was really hard on the community and it's still controversial, but really it allowed us to help ourselves and then apply for grants. And there's a lot of grant funding through state, through the revolving fund that comes down from EPA, administered by the state, and then also the state, when it has had boom cycles, it has put a lot of money into capital funding projects for municipalities. So one of the first projects we did is we secured a grant to build water and sewer capacity south of town into kind of what we call it in staff the peninsula down there, where we expect a lot of annexation to occur and development to occur off of like Soldier Springs Road and Skyline Drive. And now, I mentioned earlier, we've applied for that funding and secured it $10 million for building water capacity on the north side of town where we plan for housing to happen. So I think that that's one way that we've helped ourselves, and it will bear fruits, right? We're going to have this water and sewer capacity up there. And Derek, I asked you this question and you emailed me the answer, but I can't find it tonight. It's been too many weeks back. But the question I asked Derek is, when we have that sewer and water capacity, what is the pent up plat subdivision development applications that you know are forthcoming that will take advantage of that? And you told me that number, Derek, but I can't remember it right now, but it was a lot. It was, I want to say it was on par of hundreds of houses. Am I not over exaggerating, right?
No, Janine, no, you're right. We had one specific subdivision that really, was inhibited by this, and ultimately they chose not to keep moving forward. And that was 400 lots almost, with a large lot for potential multifamily that would have added more units. But as Janine mentioned, I mean, the reality is we're opening up a huge area. I mean, almost, a third of our city expanded. I mean, it's a large area that will be available for development. And I think that's really important. And I guess to also, if you don't mind, Mayor, to add on to the kind of just the discussion here, Janine took this question completely different than what I was thinking in my head, which is always awesome to kind of see how we all are thinking differently about this issue. Is that, one of the things that we commonly hear through the development process is what costs the money, what drives up the cost of development. And I'll just tell you, the nitpicky things of facade changes and landscaping and things like that, I'm just going to tell you, are a really small component of most of these projects. Where the money really gets put into these projects is in your infrastructure. So your water, your sewer, your stormwater, your streets, your pavement, your parking lots, things like that. And if we want to start to affect change when it comes to reducing the cost to do these types of projects so that we can get this type of development, we've got to start chopping away at the bigger picture, which is some of these infrastructure needs. And so, like Janine mentioned, by us having some of that upgraded and it not being the responsibility of the developer, that's a good thing. But also too, maybe we do start to look at what other ways can we possibly modify standards, codes, that we still get the same service, but we hopefully maybe reduce the upfront infrastructure investment so that the project starts off on a lower cost.
Yeah, and that I would say we've touched on in this presentation. That's that potential for development incentives, and I appreciate what you said earlier, Councillor Harrington, about providing some flexibility to staff to negotiate those kinds of incentives. And I will say we do that right now. There are many times when we partner with developers and we'll do sort of preemptive infrastructure renewal or new construction, knowing that people want to be there. And then that means, that the city's paid the cost and it's not on them. But I like the notion to give some flexibility, but also to establish some parameters, some sort of guardrails, so there's some predictability for that development community as well. So those are the main things that come to mind for me as and I will say the infrastructure bill passed today. And so we are going to have so much more grant opportunity, I believe, in the next probably 5 to 7 years that it's going to be really exciting and hopefully replace some of the lost grant money because the state has had a downward trend in its economics. So.
See the other city planner, Mr. Cox, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. I think just one question that we addressed after our last work session with Council, there was a question that came up. What is the price difference between like a single family home and building like a duplex or something? And talking to developers within our own community and outside community, it was found that when you're able to, maybe that cost doesn't catch up at like a duplex, but as soon as you start really investing in more units, especially in these projects that do require a infrastructure investment, that when you start adding those other units in, that profitability becomes more and more easier to kind of have a conversation as to why that infrastructure is becomes affordable to invest in. Because then you go with these new amendments from maybe like 50 units being able to be on the land to 100 possibly. And that sale price that comes back with those maybe smaller, just more affordable, higher density, just a variability of housing types that you can have does make it more kind of investment friendly. But yeah, just wanted to make that point real quick.
Thank you. And thank you for that previous answer as well, City Manager. Don't see any other hands up right now, so I'm going to go over to the public for additional comments, and we'll come back briefly before we close the work session. How does that suit everyone? Okay. Let's go to public comment. I see Brett Glass has raised his hand. Let's welcome Mr. Glass. Go ahead, Mr. Glass.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, firstly, I'd like to respond to some of the earlier questions regarding training of construction workers by suggesting that the city ask LCCC to revive its construction technology program. This program, which was run by master builder Tim Nyquist, was a fantastic resource. My wife participated in it, and she's now using the skills she acquired to build a new building out in the county. Hopefully, it would require no more than a few phone calls or a resolution from council to get that program going again, and that would help to solve any labor problems that we might have. Secondly, in regard to housing affordability, I want to point out an obvious fact. There's a floor on the cost of decent housing, especially if we pay the workers who come out of a program like that construction technology program well. Materials costs are set by external forces that we can't control. We also have property and sales taxes, utility costs, permitting fees, and a zillion little requirements we all have to meet to make buildings habitable and safe. So what do? Well, if you look back at the chart that was shown at the beginning of tonight's presentation, and I don't know if the city clerk can put it back up or not, but what it showed was that housing costs and income for surrounding cities were such that our housing costs weren't out of line. It was our incomes that were out of line. We need to create better paying jobs in this town, despite the fact that the largest employer in our town happens to be one of the stingiest bosses in the state. If we can do that, I think we'll go a long way toward solving housing affordability problems. Now, as for the type of building to encourage, I and my family own a small handful of rental properties, and we can tell you, in Wyoming, nobody wants to stay any longer they have to in the so-called middle housing that was mentioned during the presentation. They all aspire to single-family detached homes with some land around them. The majority of our renters feel so strongly about that they want to rent until they can jump straight to that level of housing. They don't want to live in the cramped, smaller housing. And our goal should be to give them the wherewithal to do that, not to enable the construction of cheap housing that doesn't meet their needs. If you do build cheap housing, I can tell you what's going to happen. due to Laramie's unique environment and our demographics, parents of university students will buy it up as kiddie condos and they'll outbid everybody else because they'll still save money relative to putting their kids in the university dormitories. And when the kids graduate, the parents will either operate them as rentals or put them up for sales to others who will do that. If that's not what we want, we shouldn't waste our efforts incenting that sort of construction. The market is smarter than all of us, and it's going to direct capital where it needs to go. Now, I do strongly agree with the comments that were made earlier that one area in which we should not compromise is parking. We need more parking, not less. And I don't know why the city staff seems so focused on destroying and limiting parking because it's unwise and is contrary to the public's desires and the public interest. So I hope that you will not approve any proposals to do that. Finally, if you do change the city codes, my advice to you can be boiled down in a single word: simplify. The UDC is a horrible monster already. It has a zillion little traps and gotchas in it, and if you want anyone to do anything positive in terms of housing, please don't make it any more of a monster than it already is. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I would be willing to serve on any committee that might flesh out some positive ideas relating to housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Open for other public comment from attendees. Taylor Norton. Mr. Norton, you've got the floor.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I just want to say that I appreciate all of the hard work and research that has gone into this exact project. I know that the housing issue in general in Laramie is and has long been a controversial, not even necessarily controversial, just a problem. And I'm glad to see that the council is finally, it seems, taking the correct steps toward mitigating the problems with the housing and rental market in the city. With that appreciation, I would also like to express my support for the proposals, generally speaking, coming from the city planner's office. I think that the suggestions are all perfectly reasonable, and I think that all of the concerns that have been brought forward, while valid, have been adequately addressed by the proposals as put forward. And I would just like to generally say that I think the city planners have done a great job with what they've suggested, and I honestly have no real complaints or criticisms of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and for your time. Other comments? Seeing none. And I'll check again if I missed anybody. I see Chair Polk from Planning Commission. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I just wanted to say thank you for providing this opportunity for Council and Planning Commission to have this conversation. I feel like we really unpacked a lot. We got way down in the detail on a number of things, and I'm anxious to understand where we're headed with next steps and what the plan will be then for creating a committee, or I heard Janine Jordan's comment earlier of her approach maybe, or her suggestion. So I'm just anxious to hear next steps. But thank you for the time. I appreciate this meeting, the joint meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good opportunity to work with our Planning Commission at the same time, with the staff at the same time. It's not something that we often do, and I think there's some merit to it. We'll probably do more of it in the future, as you've heard. A couple of observations I had about this that seem to keep coming back up from our staff in response to questions, and seem to generate some of the questions from all the members here. You know, there's some obvious things like national economic trends are impacting this, and they have been for a while. That's not new. Shortage of skilled laborers, Some of the recent issues with material costs and supply chains probably going to be a factor for a while. Regional economics and market conditions, low wages, the fact that we're right next to some booming housing markets as well that are probably vacuuming up a lot of those limited resources. So I think all that speaks to the need for this multifaceted approach that we've touched on repeatedly. I think that's all of it's going to need to be looked at. I don't know how much of it is ultimately going to fit, but all of it's going to need to be looked at, which makes this a big, big job. So I think we're going to need to be pretty innovative and pretty flexible in the face of all those challenges. I had a question about that data about out of county and out of state ownership, Mr. Cheney, is about 17%. And what was that based on? Where did we glean that from? Just county property records?
Yeah, Mayor and Council. What we do is we take assessor's data, and whoever the property ownership is assigned to, we then broke it out by state and county and where they were at, and then analyzed it that way through GIS. We can analyze that data pretty readily and pretty easily, actually. So,
appreciate that. It just makes me think about some of the previous statistics we've looked at when we have 51% plus, and I imagine it's plus now from the 2018 data, 51% of it being rental homes, rental dwellings. So 17% total of the housing being out of county or out of state. I'm not sure how that would translate. I'm not going to do the math right here, but it's a chunk. It's a chunk to be sure. I've got a couple of questions that I just don't think we really, I'm not sure what the guide path is going to be for any of it. We talked about a couple of things. We talked about a developer actually being able to get along far enough in this process and then pull out only when they start to look at public infrastructure issues, or at least that's the way I understood some of the comments that I've heard. I also heard the city manager talk about the fact that we have a budget that hasn't grown significantly in 12 years. I think if you add in inflation, it's probably even more challenging than that. And maybe that is already calculated in city manager, I'm not sure. But if there's an expectation that part of our policy approach here needs to be to figure out how to incentivize infrastructure, which to me sounds at least somewhat like subsidizing infrastructure for new development. I want to really have a good in-depth conversation about the strategies for doing that, and also say that if we're going to do that, then I think it's only reasonable to expect that there's going to be some policy controls over that. It's going to be a subsidized, or at least a somewhat subsidized or incentivized approach to new development, then I think it's only reasonable to factor in that there's going to be policy that has to be complied with and policy goals met to the extent that we can. One other observation I'd like to make is about that land and water use stewardship issue that was raised earlier in the discussion, and and how density relates to that. I think those are all important discussions. I also think that land is going to be developed in some of these growth areas regardless of our plans, and so then the question begins not whether or not the land is going to be developed for housing and various other uses, but to what standard it's going to be developed at. And that's going to be a very, very critical conversation in terms of cooperation between the city and the county. Those are some takeaways from me here as I listen to all of your questions and the comments and the answers from staff. And frankly, it's all very concerning. We've done a good job of identifying priorities and challenges. So I would hope that the next time we get here, we've started to maybe match some of those up with some of the work done by our economic development plans and some of the policy goals that I think the county commissioners, the city council members, and our planning commission have touched on. And I know we will, but I do think it's worth saying that it's a concerning set of issues. And it's not just us, right? We're a little dot dealing with this in a national struggle to address the housing and housing affordability issue. And that frankly doesn't make me feel any more secure. So like the chair said, I'm looking forward to next steps. And I know there will be some. I know this isn't just, well, here, this is the first conversation. Everybody figure out a great idea to solve it tomorrow. But I do think it's a somewhat daunting set of challenges. Other wrap-up comments from folks here. Appreciate your time. Seeing none, I don't know that we need to ask the Planning Commission to stay for our the rest of our work session process, our agenda review, and our updates. You're welcome to. Otherwise, you're certainly welcome to go and get on with your evenings. It is nice to see all of you and hear some of your thoughts, and can't wait to do it till the next time. Councilmember Harrington.
I was just waving, Mr. Mayor, just waving bye.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Planning Commission folks. We appreciate your time. Council members, why don't we go to the next part of the agenda. Which is going to be our updates and comments. And whoever's quick on the hand up draw, let's do it. Councilmember Harrington, then we'll go to Councilmember Gabriel. Councilmember Harrington.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and probably one of the Planning Commission members could have done this a little better, but they met last night. They approved an alternate lot line at 608 Reynolds. If you look at the vicinity map in their packet, it makes a whole lot of sense. They approved that. And then as the Board of Adjustments, they also approved a variance at 157 West Gibbon that had to do with sort of a strange street alignment and a street that was never paved. The owner wants to build an accessory building, would have had to have paved his street to comply with city code, so they allowed the variance in that situation with considerable work from staff, but I think they all got there to a good solution, and that's all I have.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Councilmember Gabriel.
Thanks, Mayor. I contacted the manager of the Laramie Little League All-Stars, Mitch Biggs. And we talked about maybe doing something to honor that state championship team, the 9 and 10-year-olds last week. I got in contact with Fire Chief Dan Johnson, and they got together, manager and Chief Johnson, and they're going to have an escort around the city sometime later this week. You know, they used to just put them on top of the fire engine and kind of go around town. Not the case anymore. So they're going to provide an escort, maybe with a couple of police cars and a fire engine, and have a sign that will indicate what's going on and honor that team. And it was great to have Chief Johnson and Mitch Biggs get together and get that organized. So that was something that Chief Johnson told me about last week. So glad to report on that. Also ran into a couple of people on campus yesterday that were involved with recycling, and I brought up the fact that the Laramie landfill is now accepting glass recycling. Saw a lot of the comments from counselors on that, and kudos to city staff for getting that together. But I brought up the fact that we have this available, and they weren't aware of it. So I was just kind of wondering how we might get the information out to, you know, a big entity like the university, LCCC, WyoTech, the school district and all that, and get something going. Or maybe we don't want to push this too quickly, but at least get the idea out that there is a possibility of glass recycling. I told them you had to take it out to the landfill. There's no special pickup for that. But anyway, just some thoughts on getting glass recycling information out to the public and get that going. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Councilmember Gabriel. we asked Brooks to maybe provide some more information during the announcements portion of the next meeting, which is one step we'll take there. But yeah, I think getting the word out to folks that have glass to recycle is only going to benefit that program. So I don't think there's, unless someone from city staff has other information for us, I think we'll want to get the word out and do so aggressively so people know that that's something they can take advantage of out there. I see the city manager nodding, so.
I just would remind council, you guys approved a marketing intern for solid waste. And so we're pushing information out, but I think when we get that person on board, we'll be able to be a little bit more aggressive with that. And I think that'll happen in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So Councilor Gabriel will make sure, we've got press out, but like you said, does it permeate campus? It's hard to say. And so we'll probably do some kind of targeted marketing once we have our intern on board.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for that, City Manager. That makes sense. And yes, good reminder. We did up resources out there at Public Works for a couple of reasons, and helping recycling programs was one of them. So yeah. Other comments and updates? Yeah, Councilmember Cumby, and then I'll go to Councilmember Somerville. Those are the hands that I've seen, and if I missed you, I'm sorry. Councilmember Cumby.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Albany County, Laramie City vaccination project continues to move forward. We continue meeting about 3 times a week, and we are scheduled to begin connecting and making announcements next week. Members of that group will be coming to City Council and that same evening to County Commission to make the announcement, and then we are set for an August 23 rollout of the vaccination incentive program. So we've done a lot of work and it's moving forward, and we're getting increasing numbers of contributions and monies to help us provide incentives for vaccination in our community. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. Councilmember Somerville, you were next.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a quick update on downtown Laramie Main Street. So first, I'd just like to thank Assistant City Manager Todd Fieser. He sent a really nice letter to the Main Street Board thanking them for all of their help in all the projects this year, and it was very warmly received by the board members and the hardworking business owners that work with Main Street. So I just wanted to note that. And then second, Main Street is continuing the conversations regarding the old WYO Theater that's now in Main Street's hands, and we may have some decisions from that group to share soon. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Boy, there's a lot going on in Laramie. Other updates or comments? I don't see any hand. Oh, always at the last minute.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to say I'm over the moon about having the glass recycling. And I'm really glad that Brooks, when he sent it out and when they sent the email, we need to get more people signed up to get the city emails. But I was glad he mentioned explicitly, don't put it in your single stream, your blue lidded container, because I'm afraid that could happen a lot. And I want to say that picking up the stuff that blew out when the recycling came today, I saw a lot of the wrong stuff, like egg cartons and just weird kind of plastics and films. So, I'm putting the neighbors' carts back and pulling out stuff. So I want
just
people to
wear your name tag.
Yeah, I want people to know that the city website is very good about saying exactly what can go in those bins. And it would be nice to be able to slap those on the bins. And I keep saying I'm happy to do some of that work. And I know we can get volunteers to do it. Also, it sure would be nice if Simone invent a way to hold those recycling bins closed until they're lifted up by the truck, because it's always windy by the time the recycling truck comes around, and we get a lot of trash, recycling that becomes trash blown around town. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember O'Doherty. Yeah, just make sure that when you're out there doing that public works assistance, that you're wearing your city name tag so people don't get confused. Wonder who might be rifling through their garbage. City manager, I know this issue of the bins and the wind is a long running one that's very challenging, that we've tried to look at, and the engineering there, and it's just been a consistent challenge. And I know those guys at Public Works have thought about it and talked about it extensively, and I guess it's just one of those things that we just keep at the top of mind, and if a solution presents itself, we'll see if we can implement it. But I know it's a real problem. We live in a community that wants to recycle and do a good job of that, and so we've implemented a program, and we also have gale force winds all the time, and it's just a challenge. City manager, I wanted to say too quickly, just by way of comment, I made a closing comment for our work session, and it occurs to me that it might have been a little overly grim. I do think our staff takes all of those housing issues very seriously. I just find myself being feeling somewhat daunted by the scale of the problem, and our ability to affect it, and our sphere of influence around some of those issues seems to shrink. And I don't make any comments by way of being critical of our staff, just by way of being somewhat intimidated by the scale of the problem, to be honest with you. And I think realistically, if you're not, then you might need to go back and look at that data and consider some of the things we heard about tonight again, because it's very, very serious. But I do think the staff takes it seriously, and they're working hard to do what they can, and the council looks forward to working with you more to do that. Other updates, or should we go to agenda review? Updates or comments? Didn't catch any from folks that haven't already made them. Councilmember Schmeckel, you're probably well aware of this, but at these work sessions, this spot on our agenda is just, after you've gone to some of your boards and commissions, or maybe you've had a lot of comment from constituents about a particular issue, this is that time that we set aside to kind of communicate those things, because otherwise we never really have a good time to do it. So we sort of shoehorn it into these work session meetings as a time to either make follow-up comments about an issue we've already talked about, or to update about your boards and commissions, which I think you'll be assigned to next week. So we look forward to that. Oh, Counselor, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sometimes the spacebar works, sometimes it doesn't. Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I greatly appreciate the guidance here, and if you think you're overwhelmed from the daunting task, have it be your first work session. Lots of good information here coming my way. That fire hose, it's got to be this big. That's all I can say. So, thank you.
Housing is an extreme challenge. Housing is an extreme challenge, and we share those feelings with you.
Yeah.
So you're not alone. Other comments? All right, let's go ahead and get into agenda review. The city clerk has emailed the agenda to you in your city inbox, so you didn't have a link to it on our work session agenda. No problem. He has emailed it to you now so that you can do a quick review. We'll just go through, take a look at consent agenda items, see if we have any questions, give it a couple of minutes there, and you know the drill. You know the drill. City manager, go ahead.
Mayor, I hate to start off with saying there could be an addition to the agenda, but I did want to just put you guys on notice. We are visiting with Family Promise of Laramie with respect to a potential community development block grant application. I've been deep diving into the requirements for this program today and met with them, but it is an outside possibility that I may need to add a resolution to this agenda to just greenlight us to even submit a letter of intent. I say there's an outside chance because after the deep dive I've done today, it becomes increasingly apparent to me that I'm not sure we can pull together a suitable application by the deadline of late September. And so the director and I met today, and he's reaching out to them to ask some questions about when subsequent application deadlines may be forthcoming, because it's just super complicated, basically, as you would imagine with all federal grants. And then they have a new state agency overseeing this program this year as well. So anyway, if it does come forward, it would just be a resolution sort of indicating support, because the city has to be the ultimate applicant for these funds and pass them through to the benefiting agency.
That makes sense, City Manager, and that's okay, because I think you had earlier notified the council that there was something else. There was something that needed to be pulled. So you got to add something. We've removed something. This is how it goes. I see the city clerk nodding along there. That he's tracking that for us as well. So that's okay. Other comment or input about the consent agenda? Got some presentations, proclamations, presentations. I think we are going to have Brooks Webb from Public Works added into that announcements section. City Manager, I don't know when you'd like to, maybe after staff recognition, after we do the rock star.
Yeah, Mayor, typically we just post it as announcements, and then I'll bring him in at that point. We don't usually print it, I guess, on the agenda. It's more of a verbal trigger.
That's right. We'll just throw it in at the appropriate time. That's great. Okay. Other questions about consent agenda items? So we've got a couple of permit requests. All right, I'm not seeing a lot of curiosity, which is just fine.
Mr. Mayor,
yeah.
I would like to pull the 9I, showing we support the resolution that WHAM passed to regulate money spent on campaigns. I would like to pull that. A big group in Laramie signed such a petition, and I know that they would like to address that resolution, and so I would like to put that on the regular agenda if anybody else approves. Thanks.
Yeah, I see some agreement with that. Councilmember O'Doherty, what I would request of you is that you introduce that, and you also provide some context about that WHAM discussion and how that's come to be something that's an issue that they're looking into. And I think that would be good and helpful for us as we discuss and present that resolution. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, that also makes sense that we might have some community members and they'll want an opportunity to probably talk about how they support it, which is appropriate. Okay, regular agenda items. Oh, where do we want to put that, actually? I'm open to suggestions about the resolution that we just discussed. The Vice Mayor and I talked about this with the staff at the agenda review meeting, and the thinking was we would check with Councilmember O'Doherty because she had been there at WHAM and figure out what we were going to do afterwards. Vice Mayor, I don't know where there's no natural spot to put it, so I say we just pick one. But
I think if there's going to be members of the public, I think we may want to go early in the meeting, first or second up. I think it'll be quick, but.
Yeah, okay. I think you're right. Why don't we put it after green waste? Item number, make it item number 11A or whatever.
We could probably just make it number 12.
Okay, yeah. Just reorder.
Yeah.
And then hopefully the community members that want to speak to that will speak largely through a spokesperson as opposed to individual public comments about it, since they've submitted a petition and so forth. One hopes. They can, of course, do whatever they want. But. All right. Other questions about regular agenda items? Going to hear about airport grant agreement or update to the master plan. I believe the airport executive director, manager, Amy Terrell will be here for that. Got a resolution for vaccination efforts, and you can all read. I'm just saying it out loud to facilitate conversation and discussion. Maybe we don't need any. City manager, are we going to have county folks for item 16, or is management staff going to walk us through that?
I am planning to walk you through it, and I am unaware if county folks will plan to attend or not. If you'd like them to, I'd certainly ask the sheriff to be here.
I don't know that it's required, and I don't know that we want to add any more to Sheriff Applehans' plate. My impression is he's pretty busy. I just wasn't sure if that's the way we're going to do it. I don't see a need to do that. I certainly will be interested in council opinions about that, but I think we're okay. This has been worked out. There's been good committee work on it. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, not on this subject, so if you want to.
Yeah, no, I didn't see anybody else that had an opinion one way or the other, so I think we're okay moving on.
Okay.
Yeah, you're up. Go for it.
Okay, thanks. And Councilor Somerville may want to jump in here too, but we're in the process of preparing a really quick resolution to hopefully get on the agenda next week related to a committee assignments.
Right.
So it should be fast and has to do with our new council member and a few little minor changes in current council assignments, but that was all to kind of facilitate, some movement. So,
sure.
Councilor Somerville, if you want to add anything to that or not, but just to alert you guys that it's coming.
Sorry, Mayor, go ahead.
No, that's all right.
I was just going to say, to the Vice Mayor's question, it is written and it needs to be sent into the clerk and Janine tonight.
All
I
right.
will do that.
So we either need to find a
So just
spot.
as that.
So we either need to find a spot on the regular agenda for it or put it on the consent agenda. What's your pleasure, council members? What we're doing is we're providing Council Member Schmeckel boards and commission assignments. I think that that's been worked out with the council members about who was willing to trade and reorder. Some of those changes and decisions about that were both to accommodate the new council member. Speaking about the fire hose of information. We need folks to be able to try to manage this and integrate it into their work lives and everything else reasonably. So unless there's strong feelings about it, what's your pleasure, council members? Where would you like to put it? At this point, I'm willing to put it on the consent agenda. Councilmember Cumby.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just request that Resolution 2021-57 regarding COVID-19 vaccination efforts not be placed too far down on the agenda, because after they finish with us, they will then be switching over to the county commission meeting.
Okay, so why don't we keep that as item number 13, City Clerk? I know we were going to do a little bit of reordering, but if we can keep that one held in place where it is. And then I think for committee assignments, we'll put that on the consent agenda once again, just trying to keep time management here. Everybody seems to be okay with that. All right. So, not seeing any other questions about the regular agenda. I'll make a last call for it. We have executive session. Yep, and it's on there. Okay, that's going to be a component to that meeting. All right. Well, there we are. We'll go to public comment on non-work session items. Don't see any hands raised. So back to council for very last chance on agenda or anything else. Looks like everybody's ready to end the work session. So let's close this work session and say good night to one another. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Good night.
Record.